You ready for this one? Over half of all cardiovascular events in men and a little less than a third in women take place below the age of 65. And this is a number that's been sneaking down as it's related to age for the number one killer. But it certainly doesn't have to be. Yo, 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 what is up? Welcome back to another week of How to Health. My name is Kevin. I run liftandbalance.com, where we take aim at all things health and do it in an odd, weird, interesting, and highly sarcastic manner. Today, we are talking about the longevity Grim Reaper, a disease that, at this point, will get to everybody inhabiting this beautiful floating rock if they live long enough. And the party pooper happens to be? No, not you, production team. Although, you do have that bad habit of pooping every time you never mind. This condition is heart disease, or atherosclerosis, or the buildup of plaque beneath the endothelial cells that make up our arterial walls, which eventually lead to cardiovascular stress and an event. Not an event that me or you want to go to anytime soon. So today we are going to talk about the biomarkers that you should be testing that you probably aren't, and some new research that suggests that you can uncover an elevated risk for a cardiovascular event decades before it happens. And I don't know about you, but decades seems like a pretty reasonable time to implement meaningful change for the better. And there's no better time well spent than getting and staying ahead of the longevity Grim Reaper, no? So, on the docket for the next 15 minutes and 23 seconds, we'll be breaking down how cardiovascular disease actually develops, the common markers assessed on a lipid panel, and why they're not enough. New research calling out 2 key biomarkers that should be added to testing, and how to get preventative with this top killer. Because just like one of the other top longevity liabilities that we've covered on this channel, neurodegeneration, there's no reversing cardiovascular disease. And like I said before, if you live long enough, which I know you're planning to do, it's not a matter of if, but a matter of when. Making prevention the best prescription we have. With that, let's start walking at the beat of our own heart and talk about what cardiovascular disease actually is. A little background. Heart disease kills more Americans than any other disease, accounting for 1/4 of all deaths. To add a little perspective, a woman in the United States is 7 to 8 times more likely to die of cardiovascular disease than she is from breast cancer. And when we take a look at it through the lens of the world, an estimated 17.9 million people died in 2019, representing 32% of all global deaths, with 85% of them being due to heart attack and stroke. Damn. So, what exactly is it? Well, cardiovascular disease is the overarching umbrella term used to classify a number of different conditions with the heart. And although some symptoms can be telling, such as chest pains, irregular beats, and fatigue, a lot of the damage is done in a rather silent way, slowly accumulating and increasing one's risk, likelihood, probability of an event. An event, like I said before, no one is looking forward to. So before we go any further, let's discuss what's actually happening and not happening when it comes to cardiovascular disease. First, there is a large misconception among health seekers and medical professionals that heart disease is a byproduct of cholesterol and fat accumulation on the internal walls of key arteries that eventually block the passage of blood or rupture, leading to a major cardiac event. Having many people draw the conclusion, if you reduce this cholesterol and fat, whether by lifestyle habits or medications, problem solved. So, a lot of clinical focus has been put on reducing this unfairly labeled bad cholesterol, cholesterol on low-density lipoproteins called LDL-cholesterol, and triglycerides, or fatty acids. And once a patient crosses a certain threshold in those metrics, a treatment is started, usually being a statin. And bam, pat the hand and call it a night. Now, there happens to be a number of problems with that above scenario. And first, let's start with what was accurate. Dyslipidemia, or the condition of high cholesterol and fat in the blood, has been identified as a major risk factor for cardiovascular disease and atherosclerosis. That is true. And elevated LDL cholesterol has been associated with a higher risk. Also true. But association does not mean causation. Let me explain. First, before we get into the discussion, I just want to call out the fact that on most lipid panels, LDL cholesterol is actually a calculated number instead of the actual count, making it kind of a guesstimate. And don't worry, we'll talk about that later. Second, I want to delineate that LDL-C, low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, represents the cholesterol count on the lipoprotein particle. And the lipoprotein itself is the vehicle in which the cholesterol and triglycerides travel through the blood. Now, these LDL particles actually come in a number of different forms, which are typically classified by density. But the thing that actually makes the LDL distinguished is its protein signature. And for the case of LDL, this protein is apolipoprotein B, or ApoB. Remember this. Writing it down, production team? Good. Moving on, there is increasing evidence that triglyceride-rich lipoproteins, including very low-density lipoproteins, VLDL, and intermediate-density lipoprotein, IDL, are also atherogenic. But here's where the picture gets a little fuzzy with the scenario and the methodology we talked about above. The data has shown that a substantial percentage of patients with atherosclerotic vascular disease have LDL cholesterol in the optimal range. Adding to this, many patients who receive treatment and achieve recommended LDL cholesterol levels still develop complications from atherosclerotic vascular disease, making it clear that something else is part of the problem, other than LDL cholesterol. And the data teased out what it just might be. One of the mismatches that have been identified in many patients was a discrepancy between their LDL-C, reported on a basic lipid panel, and the number of atherogenic lipid particles, which is often expressed by the number of ApoB containing lipoproteins. Wait a sec. Oh, ApoB. For example, people may have a low LDL cholesterol concentration as reported on their lipid panel, but still have a large number of atherogenic LDL particles circulating, suggesting that the number of LDL particles may be more important than the cholesterol on those particles. And like you just heard, the particles that tend to be the most atherogenic are the ApoB ones. And I know what you're thinking. What about the actual mechanisms of the disease itself? If you recall the scenario from way back when, where I called out how there was a common misconception about how the arteries actually got clogged, here's what really happens from the information we know to date. We're always finding out new information. Disclaimer, bam! The progression from a totally normal to clogged artery follows a pretty clear path. When ApoB LDL particles are abundant, meaning there's a lot, some will squeeze their way into the intermediary space behind the endothelial cells that line the artery walls. There, they can just stay for a while and leave, or they can become retained, or get stuck. Up until this point, no damage has been done. It starts to get ugly when the particles become oxidized, typically from a reactive oxygen species. Another reason to keep those ROS in check, right? These oxidized LDL particles then become toxic to the endothelium. So the endothelial cells do what any good cell would do and call the immune system via good old chemical signaling to come and fix the insult. They also secrete cytokines which stimulate the liver to produce C-reactive protein and just adds to the inflammation party. Then the immune system arrives and wiggles on in to that intermediary space behind the endothelial cells and straight up consumes the oxidized LDL particle. This consumption forms something known as a foam cell, which then takes up permanent residence in the space. And when these foam cells build, a fatty streak is formed, which is one of the early hallmarks of an atherosclerotic plaque. And from here, if the same conditions are continuously present, the damage slowly accumulates and the risk for a serious plaque or clot rise, adding additional stress and narrowing the artery, all while increasing the likelihood of a major event. And that's what happens. Not what you thought, right? Certainly wasn't what I used to think. The key thing to remember here is that LDL ApoB particles are necessary, but not sufficient for this disease to occur. Oxidation and the inflammatory response are needed as well. Now, you may say, hey, this is very interesting, but I'm healthy, I feel good, I won't have to worry about this for years. maybe decades. And it might be true, and I hope it is. But the data has shown that for most people, fatty streaks begin to form in the first decade of life. Yeah, before the age of 10. And reversible abnormal plaques are present in most individuals by the time they're in their 20s. And by the time you hit your 30s, I mean, you're done. No, I'm just kidding. But in their 30s, the average person is likely to have signs of their first advanced lesions. Yeah, I think I'm gonna go with yikes for 100. And what we know is the majority of atherosclerosis initiating cholesterol gets into the artery as passengers in ApoB containing particles, which are 90% of all LDL particles. So the question is, what are we testing? And if it's not that, why the hell not? What typically gets tested? Currently, most people undergo the standard lipid panel, which only measures total cholesterol, triglycerides, HDL cholesterol, and calculates your LDL cholesterol. And just so we're on the same page with definitions, let me go through them. LDL cholesterol is the cholesterol count on LDL particles, not the lipoprotein particle count. HDL-C is the total high-density cholesterol count. Again, not how many lipoprotein particles there actually are. Triglycerides are the concentration of fatty acids along for the ride, and total cholesterol is LDL plus HDL plus 20% of triglycerides. So when you get your blood drawn, these are the metrics that are typically assessed. Your cholesterol and fatty acid levels, but not your actual lipoprotein particle count. See the problem? These numbers alone will not provide the most accurate portrayal of your risk for all of the reasons we just discussed. So here's what you want to ask for when you go in and get your standard lipid panel. Still get all that other stuff, but add this stuff. First, ApoB, which gives you an accurate indication of your atherogenic particles. Next, ApoA. We haven't talked about this one yet. We'll talk about it a little more in a little bit, but this is a cardioprotective measurement and are the lipoproteins that transport HDL cholesterol. Next, I would suggest getting your LDL-D, which is your direct LDL count, not calculated. And lastly, if possible, get your particle size analyzed. This will give you an idea of how many small atherogenic particles you have. And all this is something that your doctor probably should be checking, but normally don't, because for some reason, the latest data hasn't made their way to their desk. So ask for it. This is key information that will help you combat your most likely longevity adversary. And before we leave the markers, there happens to be one more. A new one, identified by a new analysis that's showing to be rather important. New research, new marker. Researchers out of Karolinska Institute sought to assess the long-term risk of a major cardiovascular event by measuring ApoB, ApoA, and the ApoB to A ratio. To do this, they followed step-by-step 137,000 men and women with, like a clipboard behind them. No, I'm kidding. They tracked 137,000 men and women between the age of 25 and 84 for an average of 17.8 years. And this was part of the Swedish apolipoprotein mortality risk cohort study, where ApoB, ApoA1, and the ApoB to APO1 ratio were analyzed related to major adverse cardiovascular events. So, what did they find? First, after nearly 2 decades of tracking, 22,473 participants had a major cardiac event. Second, they discovered that low levels of the protective ApoA1 particles were associated with increased levels of ApoB and a higher risk of a major cardiovascular event. Additionally, a high ApoB to ApoA1 ratio was strongly associated with a risk of having a major adverse cardiovascular event. And here's the big money stat. The ApoB to ApoA1 ratio was elevated already 2 decades before the event. 2 decades. 2 of them. Not 1, 2 of them. It's a long time. Get a lot done in 2 decades. Thus, concluding that early detection and treatment of dyslipidemia may prevent severe cardiovascular disease and save lives. So, with all that, and if you're still here and not sleeping like production team, let's talk about what you can do. The name of the game here, my friends, is prevention and early detection. If you have longevity in mind or living your healthiest possible life as long as possible, today, right here, right now, is the perfect day to start. No matter your age or health status, get going. As I love to say, the art of doing is such a powerful practice. So here are some items to think about, to noodle on. First, if you don't do so already, perform yearly lipid screenings. Request those key markers that we discussed, especially ApoB and ApoA. Review these results with your doctor and begin to baseline where you're currently at. Then, along with that, it is super important to understand that building healthy habits early is one of the best things that you can do. Focusing on real food, structured meal timing, high quality sleep, daily exercise, stress management, eliminating toxic habits and toxins in your environment, and having a mission statement to reduce inflammation, especially the chronic type. We cover all of these topics across an array of videos on this channel, and a lot of topics have their own dedicated playlists. So I will link a few relevant starting points in the show notes below. Like I mentioned way back in the intro, when it comes to cardiovascular disease, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. So let's stack the odds ever in our favor and push that when out as far as humanly possible, giving us a nice, long, healthy run with our pretty cool meat suit and 5-pound mushy membrane to the very end. There's simply no better day to start marching to the beat of your own drum. Get it? Like beat, heartbeat, like what we talk about today. Damn it, production team. You said it wouldn't sound corny.